Okay, so put on your philosophy caps, fasten your seatbelts. So the idea is that there's just two naturally occurring symbol-using systems. I call it DNA and language, but what we're really comparing is code-directed protein synthesis to human language comprehension. So there's two simple heuristics. We divide the systems up into parts and relations, and we have a series of exposed comparisons that we can use to sort of motivate the analogy. But it has to be specific enough to distinguish when you've got something missing in one system, which we'll see, and from something that's hidden, where we can go back to the other source system and get some ideas about what that hidden thing might look like. The second heuristic is keep levels of organization aligned. Don't do something like this, where you're leaving out a principal level of organization in one system. And several of the other analogies, there's like three better known analogies between biology and language. One is one that Darwin introduced, which is a similarity between a species and a language. Darwin actually said biological evolution is like linguistic evolution, evolution of sounds, which we understand, and maybe biology is like that. He sort of used it the other way around. Those are sort of, a species and a language are sort of the same size. This is the more modern analogy, sort of the meme idea that you have like these large things on the language side that are equivalent to sort of parallel to genes, small things on the biology side. There's another one, this is called evolutionary epistemology, the idea that you have concepts and they're battling it out in sort of an intellectual ecology. In this case, you've got small things on the right and bigger things, an organism on the left. And then here's the one true analogy. Everything's small on the left, everything's big on the right. So a cell compared to a person. So there's stuff inside the cell, biomolecules, that's like sort of patterns in your brain. Multicellular organisms are like a linguistic community. So let's summarize life very quickly. So there's geology. What's in geology? There's some strings in geology, but when you dissolve rocks in water, they just fall apart. And the thing that really characterizes life are strong, covalently bonded strings that persist in water. Here's the three main ones. They're made by dehydration reactions between pairs of units. And the picture that molecular biology has given us is just insane. There's a needle, there's some bacteria on it, of course. And it's got DNA inside the bacteria. You think of DNA like that, but this is what DNA actually looks like. This is a eukaryotic chromosome tossed onto water. And the DNA exploded out of it. So if you zoom in on it, that's what it is. It's absolutely insane. Sorry, I didn't correct this slide, but if you look at the DNA, each DNA base has 2 bits to it. It can be long or short and 2 or 3 bonds. Now here's an exposed comparison. If you look at the within word versus between word connections at the molecular level, there's no mark. You can't tell where the words are. Same way in a language. If you listen to a language that you don't understand, it's just a long string of phonemes. You can't actually hear where the end of one word is. You have to recognize a word in order to figure out what the beginning of the next one is. How does the meaning work? Here's the meaning loaders. So there's the symbol, the anticodon on the transfer RNA. There's the amino acid meaning. It's attached with an arbitrary bond. And I call it arbitrary because any old amino acid can be stuck onto any old transfer RNA with an amino seal connection. The thing that determines which one is a whole set of enzymes that load particular amino acids onto particular transfer RNAs. Then it gets handed off to the chain assembler, which is made out of RNA, which we'll see is relevant coming up. The little red things are the transfer RNAs in there. And then here's the actual moment of word recognition where the transfer RNA base pairs with the message. And then the amino acids are popped off and made into a protein chain that's excreted. But look at how little information there is in a gene, just a couple hundred bytes to specify the incredible structure of an enzyme. That's because it relies on the rules of chemistry. It relies on these rigid bond angle constraints that generate 2 kinds of secondary structure, an alpha helix and a beta strand, which often form into a sheet. But actually, a lot of the work is done by van der Waals forces, dispersion forces, and basically atoms act like extremely hard, slightly sticky balls that will stick to any old other atom. And that's actually what really conditions the final three-dimensional structure of proteins, which look something like this. Here's some proteins with sort of similar syntax, little discourses with similar syntax but different function depending on their active sites. Here's a pretty dehydrogenase, so that just rips a hydrogen off of a substrate. Here's something I'm using right now. It's a voltage-gated ion channel. The green things are the voltage gating things that open that pore in the middle. Here's some proteins that bind to DNA. They kind of look like a mirror image of a little piece of a DNA strand. And here's what we heard about in the last talk. So in a lot of animals, the electron transport chain moves hydrogen to one side, and then that flows through this little motor rotor, and there's a little support stock that's holding this flexible catalytic head, and this internal drive axle rotates in there, mechanically distorts it to generate, to add that last phosphate onto the ATP, that's the cell energy supply. Here's a segregase. This is, that magenta thing is a substrate, and so what it does is it grabs onto a protein, pulls it into a single strand, and stuffs it hand over hand through a membrane. So here's the metabolic network that you see in all cells. So I hope I've convinced you that cells are these autonomous intentional agents that have tricked chemistry by using a symbol processing system in order to take over, do things that rocks can't do. So the argument is that basically language is the second coming of this kind of a system, a new higher level life form. And the analogy is that DNA is like speech strings, RNA is like the internal representations of speech strings, and then the amino acid meanings are like visual cortex representations of actions, objects, paths, things like that. So why should these things be similar? And I think the reason is when you're doing code-directed serial assembly of a parallel chain of subunits, the best you can do is do it at a point, at 0D. It's like knitting in the middle of a soccer match. I think that's the biggest reason. Now, could everybody have missed this somehow? And I would say yes, because there's a lot of parts, and it's a difficult starting point, and it has to do with the difference between the systems. So if you look at the biological systems, the cells comprehend their DNA, but they don't take proteins, stretch them out and turn them back into DNA. In language, we can do that. And from the biological point of view, it's just like a completely out of control system, because you can inject code into somebody else's head, change their mind. Cells don't allow stuff like that. They want to stop RNA from getting in there. They chew it up before it gets in. So it's a completely different system because all the code is inside. So if you had a cell, a cell-like person, they would just have this giant internal code stream that they would read and mutate and wait for things to happen. So evolution at the language level is much quicker, even though the actual speed of symbol processing is almost the same at the molecular level and at the level of speech. So I would argue that there's, sorry about the slide mangle, I would argue that there's actually very strong similarities at the comprehension level. And so what's the architecture of the system? We have a chain of recombinable symbol segments. They're recognized in small groups. You load the meanings with an arbitrary bond. The meaning units are assembled into a chain. The meaning units mostly predate the system. The amino acids are prebiotic. The assembled chain self-folds. Now, what about computers? They use symbols, but they use them in a very different way. They read symbols and they write symbols. If you look at cells, and then you have an arbitrary relationship between the symbols and stuff out in the world. If you look at cells, the arbitrary relation is early on, and most of the action happens according to the rules of chemistry in a non-symbolic format. And a cell like mine, the argument is that you've got some code on the way in, but most of the action is done by the rules of neural pattern assembly and visual and higher level cortices that was there before a language was. So let's try to use the analogy. So we'll start off with origins without the semantic urge. So how have people thought about the origin of life? Not the evolution, but the origin of life. They've thought about the RNA world, and the general idea is that RNA can act as a one-dimensional symbol string with little binary features on it, or it can fold up into a three-dimensional structure and catalyze things. And it's at a key point at the origin of the system. Now, if you look at the evolution of language, the problem is animal call systems already have meaning. And that's a major problem for extending them, because these alarm calls are hooked up to the emotional system, like danger, like, overhead eagle. If you look at language, high frequency polysemous words like, over, put, give, line, big, they're kind of stripped of emotion. And so one of the problems we have with language is how do we get around evolutionary psychology? Because that's kind of a dead end. All mammals have that same kind of alarm call system. So perhaps we could imagine some kind of birdsong bootstrap, because if you look at birdsong, there's birdsong at the top, same time scale. And that's Steve Jobs saying, "This is Steve Jobs" from my old Next computer back in the day. You can see that the birdsong has plenty enough features that can be recombined in different orders very rapidly. It could easily be a speech stream, but it isn't. It doesn't have any meaning. And what is it? We think it's due to sexual selection. So why is that guy on the right's nose red? It's because the ladies liked it. Why does that female baboon have that little red thing on her butt? That's because the guys liked it. It's sexual selection, not functional. So what's a linguistic RNA world? Well, what's in between the DNA and the proteins? Well, you got RNA. And so the idea is that internal representations of speech sound strings, before they were interpreted to mean anything, might have some interesting computational properties. Now, that just sounds like a completely unreasonable idea, but take account that the biologists took like 2 or 3 decades before they really believed that RNA could actually be a catalyst. It took a very long time before that finally got sort of, like the ribosome does the actual linkage between the peptides. Everybody thought it was the proteins, but strip off all the proteins, ribosome still works. So what about meaning? Well, we already have a serial assembly of content system in our visual system. So we basically look at things 2 or 3 times a second with our visual system, and that serial stream comes in, and we assemble some kind of scene representation out of that scene. And what are the units that are being assembled? Well, at the molecular level, you could say amino acids are representations of categories of reactive chemical collisions. There's multiple pathways to multiple amino acids. And similarly, before language, you see objects and actions and paths, and you have visual cortex representations of sort of general objects, actions, and paths. Those are the units that we're thinking of attaching together. So let's just quickly look at a tiny bit of MRI data. Here's some visual mapping data, auditory mapping data, somatosensory mapping data, having somebody read in the scanner versus Hindi, having somebody look at a picture book without any words and direct their gaze around to do like a scene comprehension, scene assembly. If we look at all that data right here, what you can see, the scenes are in white, and the language is in yellow. If you look at the STS, you can see there's more, just outside of the visual and auditory maps, in between the visual and auditory maps, you see more language activity on the left hemisphere and more scene assembly activity in the right hemisphere. Same thing in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. You see more language activity in the left, you see more scene assembly activity in the right. And that's so we can walk and talk at the same time. So you assemble the actual scene mainly in your right hemisphere while assembling the language-driven fictive scene in your left hemisphere. So there's 2 preadaptations. So a long history of sexual selection for vocal control, mainly involving the cerebellum, because the cerebellum has actually expanded a lot more than the neocortex when you compare a non-human primate to humans. And the second thing is having this serial assembly of content device as a visual animal, mainly in your higher level visual areas and areas surrounding those higher level visual areas. And then the only thing you have to do is basically just attach those 2 things up to each other. The end. Okay, I'm ready. Questions? Any questions? Stunned silence? What?
So you mentioned that the biological side is like comprehension without the production component. So I'm wondering, I mean, production would be Lamarckian, right? That would be somehow immediately changing the DNA from your experience in the world. But I'm thinking about epigenetic kinds of factors that people are talking about now, that where you do somehow modify the end product, the analogy to your lack of.
Well, yeah, so the question was about, like, you know, lack of production. So cells communicate. They just don't use code for this purpose, although they might. There's exosomes which are shed and they contain genetic material, but the thing that they don't do is, it was Francis Crick called it the central dogma because he didn't know what dogma meant. He thought it meant central theory. But the idea is that the information comes from the DNA, it goes into proteins, but it never goes directly back in the sense of taking a protein, stringing it out, and sort of reverse translating it back into code. And that's something that we can effortlessly do. But it doesn't mean that cells don't communicate. They have, like, you know, detailed, incredible communication back and forth, and they even use code for that, but they don't generate the code from proteins. That's really the difference. We can do that. And so there's no need for sex in language. You know, like actual biological organisms have this method of sort of trying to mix up genetic material. Language is just like this wild and crazy free-for-all. You can just inject code into somebody's head, and you can cause things to happen in their brain. It's very unsafe. So, and the speed, the actual speed of language comprehension is a couple words a second. That's actually the speed of translation in eukaryotes. It's a couple amino acids per second. It's actually amazingly the same speed, even at these tiny little levels. And so when you look at sort of the speed of evolution, sort of cultural evolution versus biological evolution, it's thousands of times faster in cultural evolution. But and the argument is really what's causing that is this wild and crazy, like, you know, you can just like talk to anybody you want and send code to them and directly affect their minds.
How do you think about what, you know, forms the system? So in DNA, everything is, you know, in the gene, and then it has consequences for survival, and so it leads to the next generation, and that's a direction completely from the low level, you know, definition out to the world. Whereas, you know, when you're talking, you had some idea, some extremely complex idea that you were trying to communicate to us, and it ended up all the way, you know, down to the very basic. So it seems like a totally different direction of causality.
Okay, so if you think about, like, so what is the purpose? You know, how did life originate? It had to be some kind of tricky way of hiding. You're trying to overcome determinism, basically. That's what life does. It forces things to happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. And the argument is that at the language level, you have the same kind of thing going on. So we wanted to take powerful control of our minds in a way that animals don't have. And so the argument is that you have these strings of symbols coming in. Now, they come in, a baby has to learn a language. You know, cells know a language right at the beginning. So that part is quite different. But the argument is that this linguistic system essentially provides some kind of powerful operating system that can sort of like get on top of your mind and control it and force things to happen, you know, out in the world that animals can't do. I mean, you can just see that we just have like tremendously more intentionality than animals do. And what is the trick of that? I'm arguing that the trick is just having some kind of code system where you hide code. Like if you think of code, the bonds between individual nucleotides are all equivalently stable, and so it's kind of hiding out from the soup, and that's the argument with language too, is you want some kind of vocal stream that sort of hides out from the soup, but then can sort of like code for things that can generate some kind of mind controller.
Thank you so much.